this topic. In particular, thank you, the Health and Wellbeing IRP Collaboration team for joining. I do hope that we touch on some of the health aspects when we get to the discussion at the end. So I'll make this brief so we can get to our presenters. And again, so I apologize, I'm phone only. I'm unable to connect to Zoom at the moment. So unfortunately, you won't be able to see my face, which is probably a good thing. Okay, so just a reminder, IRP Collaborations brings together federal scientists and partners to address hard problems in the Arctic. These webinars are kind of part of that. We, believe in collaboration to address these difficult problems that we see in the Arctic. The IRP Arctic Data team addresses environmental intelligence issues. So as such, we tend to invite presenters to these webinars who are working on or with data that can be used to support decisions and policy. So that kind of environmental intelligence focus. So today we're going to hear a presentation on the use of indicators for urban sustainability in the Arctic, very topical subject. But before we turn to that presentation, I do want to invite Alan Pope from NSF. He's going to give us some background on some diversity and inclusion efforts at IARPIC. So over to you, Alan.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. I liked in the agenda, this is listed as a public service announcement, and that's kind of exactly what we had in mind, that the Diversity Inclusion Working Group has been around for a little bit, but we've ramped up activity recently, especially in terms of alignment with current administration priorities, has allowed us to hopefully be more active within this interagency space. So the team leads, it's a very, shall we say, team-oriented team leadership in that there's me, there's Olivia Lee, there's Tracy Curry, Sarah Ahrens, and Monica Sickend are all of our current co-leads. And in terms of what the group does, we've been focusing recently on a new series of kind of reading and discussion group type of activities where we put out a resource. It might be a particular reading. We're going to have some suggested podcasts, things like that, and then gather together a group to discuss these issues that are important for our Arctic research community. So our most recent topic, for example, was on the topic of allyship. Upcoming ones will talk about co-production of knowledge in the Arctic. And we're still putting together what the slate of activities looks like for the fall. But most importantly, we don't want this to be a standalone group. We want this group to be integrated through, when we were doing these planning conversations, it's like, okay, so which other collaboration teams should you be working with? And we're like, all of them. We should all be working together because this is not a separate issue. Diversity and inclusion is an issue that is part of all of the work that we do. And so this is kind of putting out the call there to invite all of you to participate in our D&I meetings and activities, but also as discussions and ideas are coming up in the data team, we hope that you see us as a partner. And if you're having ideas, please do invite us in as well if there are particular joint focus actions and things like that that you'd be interested in. Yeah, so that's what I've got for now. Our next activity, we're working with a possible speaker and we need to find out what her availability is, and then we'll schedule that. But yeah, does anyone have any questions about the DNI group, what we do, things like that? There is more information in the terms of reference and things like that on the IRP webpage, but I didn't want to just read them at you or anything like that.
This is Mike Allen. I don't know if you plan to stay on the call, but maybe if you can weave in some of that co-production into this conversation, I'd be always interested to learn more about interpretations of what that means.
Yeah, for sure. And I am planning on sticking around. It sounds like an interesting topic.
Terrific, thank you. So any questions for Alan before we turn to our presenter? Yeah, thanks so much, Alan. And the open invitation for this kind of thing. I thought this would be a good time because I do believe our speaker is an early career scientist, so I thought it was appropriate, at least in that regard. But the door is open anytime. We'll be looking out to proactively engage you and bring you into relevant data team activities.
Great, thanks so much.
Thanks. Okay, so our presenter, which we're going to turn to, I saw her work. She presented at the American Association of Geographers annual meeting in April. I thought it was awesome, and I thought it would be a good idea to expose the IARPIC community to that work, especially as the IARPIC looks more to engage more in the social sciences. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speaker, Ms. Emily Zhang. Over to you, Emily.
Just to make sure, can everyone see my screen? If I could just get a thumbs up or confirmation.
Yep,
Great, great, thank you. Well, thanks, Mike, for the introduction and for having me again. It's a pleasure to be here and kind of share the research that I conducted over the past year. Again, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Emily Zhang, and I'm a recent graduate of the Geography Department at George Washington University in DC. So today I'll be sharing with you guys the thesis research that I've conducted over this past year, titled "Who Gets to Measure Arctic Urban Sustainability and Locating Knowledge Production Beneath the Power of Indicators." And I approached this through a case study of an international standard called the ISO 37120 Standard for Sustainable Cities and Communities, and its application in a National Science Foundation project called Promoting Urban Sustainability in the Arctic, Partnerships in International Research and Education, which I'll be referring to as PIRE from now on, since it's kind of a mouthful. So for some context on today's presentation, I'd just like to emphasize two key components that frame my research. The first one being my role as a direct participant on PYRE, who alongside a broader research team contributed to putting together our database of 46 northern cities along the guidelines of the ISO standard. And then there's a second component where I take a step back and provide an analysis of the standard that we use to guide our database, especially in terms of who created that standard and why. And then in addition, observing and highlighting the experiences of my PIRE colleagues who've been involved with this ISO data collection process. So first I'll give some background on the ISO and the standard of focus, and then I'll give some background on the PIRE project and the structure of our database. So how we went about the data collection process, what the data actually looks like before introducing my research questions. And then after that, I'll get into my research methodology and then some of the theoretical frameworks that inform my work. And then I'll just share some insights from the interviews that I conducted. So kicking things off with the ISO, some of you might already be familiar with their work. They're an international level organization made up of member countries from across the world, and they're based in Geneva, Switzerland. And those member countries are represented by their national standards body. So for example, the American National Standards Institute is the member country that's representing the US within the ISO. So this means that the ISO is neither strictly public or private because each country's national standards body varies, and it's ultimately up to them what that makeup looks like. So China's representation is state-led, for example, while the US is made up of a hybrid system of government agencies, but also private companies. So for the most part, they've predominantly focused on creating safety, engineering, and management standards, but they've recently expanded their work to include topics like smart cities, resilient cities, and sustainable cities. And as of 2018, they've published over 20,000 standards. And the standard that we used in our PIRE project is the 37120. And it was originally published in 2014 and then reworked and published again in 2018. So these are just 3 example indicators. There are 137 of them, but I just chose 3, as well as the domains and topics that the standard covers. So moving on to PIRE. PIRE began in 2016 and it's coming to its formal end by way of funding next year. It's a multi-year research collaboration bringing together an international and interdisciplinary team. So we have fields ranging from physical, geography, and climatology to sociology, political science, human geography, and architecture. And over the course of the project so far, the team has led field course trips, published in a variety of journals, and as well as 2 books, and then also led a K-12 education initiative, all of which has an overarching and common focus on urban environments in the North. So our main research objective has been the creation of a data repository of indicators across 46 cities, as shown on this map. Our original aim was to construct that framework from scratch, to be able to account for unique Arctic-related challenges like permafrost thaw, high energy and food transport costs, among other things. But in 2018, after many, many meetings and a lack of progress towards creating this original framework, our PI made an executive decision to implement the ISO 37120 in order to move things forward. And so this decision was met with resistance, as you'll see later through some interviews, but also a sense of relief in having structure and something to begin our data collection process. So in assembling this database, researchers like myself followed the general methodology of striving towards the most recent city level data, but where that was not available, we would look for county, regional, and then national level data as a last resort. The majority comes from statistical databases, municipal websites, journals, and then in some cases, we got data through personal outreach. And our database and data collection process and the methodology behind it obviously raises up important concerns of data quality, scale, and timeliness, but ultimately we decided that where city level data wasn't available or accessible to us, moving down this chain would at least help us to form a starting point. So we would then calculate or transform the data that we collected into indicators as defined by the ISO, since the goal of that framework is towards standardized metrics across space. And this is really interesting because in geography, we're always talking about and thinking about space, whether we like it or not, and we think about differentiation of space, and the change of that over time. But with global standards like these, space is kind of treated as undifferentiated, and it's ultimately trying to distill this variation and diversity into comparable metrics. And so this entire phase of our project lasted for around 2.5 years, 3 years, and it culminated in 101 of the 137 ISO indicators being fully collected or completed. And then while this is our most tangible research output, I've become really interested in how our project has evolved, and also thinking of the daunting question of what do we do with all this data now that we have it and it's concentrated in this pretty daunting and chaotic spreadsheet. When I came on, ISO data collection was a very clearly defined task, and it gave me and other researchers kind of a sense of purpose and direction. But with all research output, as many of you guys are probably familiar, outputs tend to be favored because they mark a sense of accomplishment or they signal an endpoint. All the while, though, processes that are embedded in that research can be obscured from sight. So essentially, we have this large, impressive, yet flawed database, but there is a gap related to what these indicators mean, what do they really measure, and whose interests do they really serve. So this leads me to the questions that motivate my research, the central one being, what do indicators reveal about the knowledge production process? And relatedly, these sub-questions, which are explored through interviews, who created the standard and why? How did researchers use the framework and confront challenges related to it? And then lastly, what do indicators fail to capture? And that last one is really important and interesting because there's a bit of tension between how the creators view this as a comprehensive assessment of urban sustainability, and then contrarily, how PYRE researchers view its limitations when it's applied to a unique region like the Arctic. So my final study includes a mixed methods approach with a principal component analysis on the indicators and a corresponding index and map series. But for purposes of time, I'll only focus on the critical analysis portion. So for that, I conducted semi-structured interviews with experts or professionals who created the standard, as well as researchers in PYRE who applied it. And the most important theoretical framing that's kind of informing all this work is the critical studies of quantification. So drawing from the sociology of quantification, which says that the creation of indicators and numbers more generally marks a highly social and political process that can be seen as neutral, but those social processes are often hidden from view in the final presentations of them. And then also relevant to this discussion is how subjective matters like urban sustainability are quantified, and when many areas under this umbrella term, so to speak, are incommensurable. And then I also look to urban scholarship, where geographers like Jennifer Robinson and Anyana Roy expand on how we think about cities. And while their work is done with a predominant focus on cities in the global south, it holds particular importance in the Arctic context, because cities in the Arctic don't fit into conventional definitions of cities that are characterized by population thresholds, density, or growth patterns. But they're cities in their own right because of the many functions that they serve their residents, and considering how they've been home to millions of people collectively and have been home to indigenous communities for millennia. And then also thinking about what we mean when we say sustainability, and looking at the roots of this concept from its first formal articulation with the Brundtland Report to the SDGs more recently, because a lot of critical scholars remind us that what's classified as environmentally responsible or sustainable may not be socially so. And then to wrap this portion up, these areas of inquiry are not only relevant in investigating who creates standards like the one that we used, but also in reflecting on how our own research is an act of power and of making some things more visible than others. So in our case, how does our use of the standard reproduce dominant narratives of sustainability? And then also, how can it potentially inform future work on urban indicators? So I'm going to start off with the expert interviews first here. The standard has been widely communicated as being driven by cities themselves, as you can see with their infographic here on the left of this slide. But this is at odds with what some expert informants revealed to me. The one up top told me about the World Bank pilot study and initiative that was responsible for shaping the standard. He said that in that pilot study they designed with 10 cities. They found that there were 11,000 indicators being collected with only 2 in common, which they thought was extremely inefficient. So in this way, the standard was created to help them reduce this inefficiency gap. And then there was another informant who was a representative from one of those pilot study cities. He put himself in the shoes of the World Bank and reasoned that the standard's original purpose was to be a sort of yardstick to understand where a city was and if the bank should make an investment there. So digging a little bit deeper into the origins of this standard, we see that these indicators were initially created as a tool for the World Bank to weigh project and investment needs in cities where they have these material interests, while simultaneously being rebranded through the official ISO process as being city-defined and city-led. And then along similar lines, there are certain voices being elevated through the standards making process. An interviewee who held a senior level position in the US delegation for a separate ISO standard, it was the 14,000 series on environmental management. He told me that the US dominated the discussions and had ideas on what the standards needed to be. So even before these international meetings, certain member countries come in and dominate the process towards publication. And then there was another informant that said for the 37120 standard, the World Council on City Data, the WCCD, which is a city data oriented organization that's separate from the ISO, but within the member country of Canada. He told me that they were probably the loudest and harshest voiced, but that it's still technically and on paper just one of many voices. So for the 37120, at least Canada had the most power and sway in determining the contents of this particular standard. And as it turns out, this organization was a direct offshoot from that same World Bank pilot study that I just mentioned. And now shifting gears towards the interviews with researchers. It was very apparent that there were many conflicted reactions and feelings towards using the ISO in our project. So speaking on the meetings for creating a framework from scratch, one of the researchers told me you could never make progress. There were always disagreements. She also felt that with the ISO, at least some other people besides us have done some kind of labor to determine these. And this researcher felt some sense of ease in having structure and guidance, while another colleague revealed her disappointment in adopting the ISO 37120. She told me it was just frustrating being tied to that and that we didn't design it ourselves. So she kind of brings up concerns about how quote unquote global in this sense does not necessarily mean that it's representative of the North, even though it purports global applicability. So where does this leave us in engaging with a framework that's really fraught with biases, especially in its Western-centric approach towards sustainability that kind of marks binaries of good versus bad performance or sustainable versus unsustainable? It has at least begun to reveal how messy the research process is and how much can be hidden when indicators are created and used, and then also how PYRE researchers formed their own paths of creativity around what was a really rigid standard. So these two informants here worked closely together on the urban planning domain, and the informant on top talked about how it brought to light just how blurry and ambiguous city boundaries are, which is important because when we talk about city or urban sustainability, and sort of leans towards treating these places as self-contained entities that are independent rather than accounting for broader territorial or regional interactions and links. And then his colleague down below also noted how working with these indicators encouraged them to think more critically about quote unquote good urban development. For instance, he said that with the ISO standard, you're operating under the assumption that population density and built up density are the main drivers for good urban development. But they've instead opted in their sub-research, which is related but tangential to PIRE project, to examine the social impacts and social outcomes of urban planning initiatives in select Arctic cities. And then also, it's interesting, as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, to look at the contrast between the standard's creators and users on what's missing from the current standard. So the three expert interviewees highlighted on the left responded with affirmations of the standard being comprehensive, but researchers on the other hand point out, for example, that it has an unsaid background and neoliberal view on how the world should rank, which leaves little room to give places like Russian industrial cities more depth or more room to account for historical legacies from the Soviet era or cultural phenomena, just kind of automatically placing them as areas that have low levels of sustainability. And then also the ISO is completely silent on many sources of unsustainability. That bottom quote from a researcher says that it ignores historic systemic injustices in the ways that cities are put together, and that there needs to be more indicators on equity, which is salient for cities of the Arctic, but cities globally. And that inequality piece is really important, especially beyond measures of just Gini index and counts of those experiencing homelessness, if we want to account for things like economic and health disparities between different ethnic and racial backgrounds. So now I'd like to share one more insight before offering my concluding remarks, especially from one researcher who said, we need to think about research that is done on the Arctic by people not from the Arctic and done without consultation with people who live there. That's a big problem. It's like people coming from Uktiagvik down to like DC and saying, we're going to study DC and we're going to do it based off of what we think is right, and we're not going to ask you about it. We're just going to overlay our own standardized form of assessment based off all sorts of things that you don't understand. And this really speaks to the consequences of and flaws of our research so far, and mine with this thesis, and something that's largely missing from our project with very few exceptions, which is the input that's coming directly from those who live and work in the Arctic. So I can sit here all day and talk about how these indicators and how their creation and use are both very power ridden, but that still neglects the people for whom Arctic urban sustainability is the most immediate and pressing concern. So for some concluding thoughts, so far this research has begun to unpack how these indicators are situated and embedded in their creation and use. and that they can create or recreate certain power dynamics and tensions, considering that it comes from a Western institution and is also being used in one with our project, all of which plays a big role in shaping how urban sustainability is theorized and talked about. And then it also points out how the process of creating the standard prioritized technical expertise from the West while maintaining that it was driven by cities everywhere and cities globally. And then lastly, in implementing the ISO, PYRE researchers showed mixed and conflicting feelings towards the standard, the decision to adopt it, and its silences and limitations. But they also work around the confines of the standard to create their own meanings and insights around applying this framework, which can hopefully add to these broader discussions of knowledge creation, and then also how international standards like the ISO 37120 could potentially be made more useful to places like the Arctic. So that wraps up my presentation for today. Thank you again for listening and for attending. I'd just like to quickly acknowledge my thesis committee, Dr. Ortung, who's here today, Dr. Attia and Mr. White, as well as the GW Department of Geography and the NSF for making this research possible. So I'll be happy to discuss any questions or answer any questions and engage in discussions with you guys. Thank you.
Emily, thanks so much. This is Mike. So you nailed the time, by the way. Now, you just recently defended this for a master's, correct?
Yes.
Okay, congratulations. So you've definitely got good timing with all this, and terrific information. A lot of this resonates with a lot of things we've been talking about here at IRP in particular. You know, better inclusion of voices in the Arctic and in all kinds of studies, and definitely data sets that really could be used to inform decision making, policy making is particularly important. So I do want to open up to questions, comments, reactions to this presentation. And also, I believe Arctic Data Center was on the call, so if you want to make a comment on, if you have any announcements or questions about plans for managing this data, disseminating it, it's an NSF-funded project, so I think that's relevant and to bring up in this call. So, questions, comments? Hazel, if you don't mind, I can't see the raised hands if there are any.
Well, I can ask a quick question. I don't see any other raised hands yet, but my experience working in the federal government in the data management area, we implement the ISO standard 19115 for data set metadata. And I think it's been broadly expanded to other information resources. And everything you said resonates very well with our experience of implementing that in the federal government. I think there's a level of technical rigor in the ISO standards that is really hard for people who are not familiar with them to adopt and get up to speed on. Although, you know, we can tell some success stories just within the IRP community, and Dennis is on the call and he can talk about his project with MD Tools that does implement that, as well as the CSDGM, which is the older FGDC standard for metadata. But there's certainly other standards. The new ISO standards are incorporating data quality standards that were previously in a separate series, and you know, there's a lot. You know, so this is fundamentally something that we do in data management, is trying to standardize the way that information's collected and presented. And I think this critique is very important and helpful to have, and especially transferable, I think, potentially to city planners and the way they're thinking about sustainability is, you know, transferable to many of the other things we're trying to do in IRPIC, even if they're just a few cities that are technically within our purview here. I wanted to mention, I invited the health and well-being team in particular because I know there have been a number of seminars over the past couple of years about air quality in Fairbanks, and that's potentially a global phenomenon. You mentioned the Russian cities and how those rank. So I anticipate that, I'd be interested in hearing if there's any more detail you have on Fairbanks and air quality to help make that connection. So yeah, thanks everybody for coming, and please ask questions and follow up on my questions.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. So Emily, do you want to address any of those questions? And I'll just tag on to that very data level comment about ISO standards. Thinking about metadata, something that I think there might be a standard out there, but it doesn't mean that it's met. But including these caveats, maybe in a fitness for use statement on data like this. So if like a user pulls down this index data that PYRE creates, some research might want to see kind of well-structured and thought-out critiques that have come from the developers. In this case, we have some reactions from some of those that were involved in developing the index. That kind of information could be used to help guide the additional users in terms of thinking about fitness for use, where the data may be lacking, and then similarly coming from the researcher data. Storage and dissemination that the NSF Arctic Data Center organizes is, can we accommodate these kinds of semi-structured qualitative data, or is it something that, in this project we might just be looking at disseminating the quantitative index data without the semi-structured interviews? I, in particular, as a social scientist, would love to see the semi-structured interview results in addition to those the quantitative index data. So a couple kind of comments / questions there, open for discussion. Emily, if you want to react to any of that, or others on the call, please do.
I can hop on for a sec. It's Erin with the Arctic Data Center. We do absolutely accept semi-structured as well as quantitative data. It's one of the things I'm kind of pushing against. It's a misconception that data is only, Excel tables and that's sort of it. But the Arctic Data Center, we're equipped to hold media. Like if you recorded the interviews and it's appropriate to archive those, we could take that. We could take the semi-structured transcripts. We can take your quantitative data. So it really is a home for all of the research products that you feel are appropriate to deposit. So I can just throw that in there. Absolutely, you can archive it.
Thanks so much for that clarification. Glad to hear the direction that you're promoting with the qualitative data.
Yeah, and I think this also brings up an important point that we've been grappling with, is that this ISO data only, and I mean indicators in general and statistics as well, it captures a point in time. So some of our data, it's just a large range longitudinally of, some data is as old as 1999. I think that might be our oldest data point, but then some is just very recent, depending on the resources. Like the Scandinavian Arctic cities just tend to have more funding and more room to do these sorts of data collection activities. But something that we're looking to do, especially for Fairbanks, because Jonathan, I know you just mentioned that, is to look back in time and kind of do a time series collection of what we can find according to the ISO and look at that change over time. We think that will inform, long-term analysis, which is what sustainability is really concerned with. And then also on the air quality stuff, I know in the environment and climate change section, they have just one indicator, or I guess 3 indicators. One's just on greenhouse gas emissions per capita. The next is particulate matter, and then fine particulate matter. There might be a few others, but I don't know off the top of our head what our data for the Alaskan cities looks like. And then one more thing is that we had 2 undergrad research assistants who were working on a website. And so we've recently launched a website that houses all this data. And I'll share that with you all in the link as well.
Excellent. So others, I did maybe to nudge the conversation a bit more. You brought up a lot of important topics here, Emily. social equity that you mentioned, obviously a common critique in the sustainability framework put forward first by the Brundtland Commission. Health, clearly health and well-being. These are performance areas that are very important, especially in the not just Arctic context, but rural in general, where there's non-quantifiable valuables that contribute strongly to health and well-being. Clearly, these are missed, and just comments on that, reactions, and I'm wondering if we have health and well-being on the line. Any ideas on how to address that shortfall from like a quantitative level? Obviously, the answer would be how do we verify these kinds of data with the locals? Does this make sense? Which is the work I believe that Emily has begun to do with her semi-structured interviews.
Yeah, I can jump in here. I'm sort of thinking about the research that we've done on health and well-being, which does a lot of this type of data analysis, Emily, where we get indicators at the community level within Alaska, and we actually have been able to link them to health data. Two of the indicators that we've used a lot of is the proportion of homes with running water in rural Alaska. And so we have been able to link that into health data. And we do have an ongoing project now that Jonathan mentioned where we are going to be looking at wildfire smoke and trying to connect that into respiratory diseases. So I'm sort of listening. It's been great to listen to your presentation with this large scale data collection process and think about how do we make the connections between that and sort of the smaller scale research that we've actually been able to link into health outcomes. So it's a lot of food for thought. And the other thing I've thought of with IRPIC is, which it sounds like some of this might get at, is just sort of a climate change vulnerability index for communities. And if, you've got sustainability here, but I do wonder about vulnerability and linking that into sort of health and well-being. So, but I haven't gotten very far along in my thoughts on that, but.
For my thesis, I was actually trying to draw from one of my advisors, introduced me to the social vulnerability to environmental hazards at the US county level that was done by University of South Carolina. And so they take different indicators across demographics, health, socioeconomic background, education, and I think there are a few others. And they use a PCA technique. So I began that process just by looking at our database as a whole, but I agree it would be interesting to kind of be more intentional about picking out the indicators that kind of inform climate vulnerability, which is something that we haven't thought about, and making an index based off of that with the most recent city level data would be something that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think that, developing these kind of indices could have multiple uses. And, I wonder, Emily, if you're thinking about the way researchers could be using these data you create for other purposes and some of the risks there. When you look at derived products, you start to get distant from the source and even more, lack of insight into the knowledge processes and everything that went into creating these data. And just wondering your thoughts on that in terms of how you think the data could be used, some of the risks, and some ideas going forward of how we can mitigate that.
Yeah, well, I have a lot of feelings about the quality of data because that's completely out of our hands and most of it is self-reported. So I'm not really sure in terms of integrity. Of course, we want to believe that it's the best available data to work with. But that's something that's always on our mind, and where we were a little hesitant to kind of create these indices at first because of the geographic scale. So I would say like 25% of our data is actually at the national level just because we couldn't find anything at the county, state, or regional level. But we thought, to be able to work with some of these quantitative analyses, we have to do something about that. And at least have some data points. So that's something that I'm not really sure in terms of data trustworthiness, especially in some of the Russian cities where you have a lot of municipal offices that report directly to the regional governments, and they need to look good for funding purposes and things like that. So it's completely out of our hands, and that's something that we will always struggle with, I guess.
Great, thank you. I have lots of questions, but others, we do have a good chunk of time here for conversation. So please jump in if you have ideas, any reactions.
I have another follow-up on the air quality piece, and but first I'd like to just make a broad observation that the utility of these indicators is precisely to be able to summarize at a higher level, like at the global level in this case, but we're also interested in national indicators across regions. Part of the problem we have in our research programs is that they're project oriented and they're one-off, and often they're responding to a specific need. Could be an applied science need. It could be more of a for lack of a better word, pure science inquiry. But then the project ends and it doesn't contribute to this long-term basis of knowledge and building a database that can be compared across these projects. So we've come up with ways to kind of fill the gap, but I think these indicators are a potential solution and something we need to look at across IRP and start to plan for and develop them for the Arctic. One of the problems with the air quality one that I can see, and I'm a novice to this topic, so please correct me if I say anything that's incorrect, but the Fairbanks, notwithstanding the fire particulates issue, which, yeah, I understand that's a growing problem, also associated with climate change, but there's also a problem with wintertime. There's an inversion in the atmosphere, and where it might be a sensitive subject, so maybe that's why Dana didn't bring it up before, but a lot of the air quality issue is produced within the city, so there's a political, and also it's a, the index for particulates or whatever it is in this standard might not be linearly related to something like the health impacts. So there could be a lot of particulates being generated from one city and not having that particular impact. But where in Fairbanks in the winter, under certain environmental circumstances, it has a very large impact on health. So I don't know how you address these particular, I'd just characterize them as non-linearities that tend to happen in the real world. It's very hard to compare two different cities if those are involved.
Yeah, and we always talk about they kind of brand it as, apples to apples comparisons. But I know Bob always jokes it's kind of apples to oranges because that very data collection process is going to vary across cities. So you're comparing data that's different, but making city level assumptions across space. So it gets a bit problematic. So that's another big data challenge. Yeah. There's just lots of challenges. Yeah.
Mm.
So Emily, something I thought said was really profound. A lot of these indices, the big driver is convenience. It's something it's kind of clean, has a beginning and end, and in the end you have kind of a clean result. But of course, the process is riddled with all these problems that don't necessarily result in the best data. So one question I have about the internal research process and decision making is, why were the smaller cities? So many of the cities in the Arctic are tiny, and this is where you'd get your biggest critiques on the applicability of these indices. I'm wondering the decision-making process behind selecting the cities that you did select to include in the monitoring.
That is a great question that I will hand off to Bob because when I joined the project, the cities were already selected. Sorry, Bob, to throw you on.
No, that's a good question. We actually selected the cities that have over 12,000 population. I think when we put in the proposal to the NSF for this project, our idea was that, you know, there are a lot of people working on the smaller cities, the rural areas, the indigenous communities, and they're, you know, and obviously we need much more of that kind of research. But a niche that wasn't being filled was the bigger cities in the Arctic. And many of us come out of a background in Russian studies. That's where my expertise really is, and several of the other faculty members involved, and that's where our strongest international connections really are. So we were thinking about cities like Norilsk, Murmansk, Archangelsk, some of these bigger, you know, northern cities and some of the problems that they're facing. And then, you know, in the US, obviously that we were just looking at Fairbanks, Anchorage, and Juneau. Juneau being pretty far south, but defined by the NSF as part of the Arctic. So that's how we ended up with those. But it would be, you know, even at that level, the biggest cities in the Arctic are 300,000 people, going down to 12,000. So we spent a long time trying to figure out what is a city and what functions does it perform, and how do the cities in the Arctic really differentiate themselves from other cities. So yeah, that was a little before Emily joined the project. We had all those discussions, but that was the basic idea, was to try and fill this niche in the literature and looking at the bigger Arctic cities rather than the smaller ones.
That's terrific. Thank you for the background. I mean, eventually you do have to make decisions for the study. It's just, you know, I'm a geographer, Emily, as well, so I understand we oftentimes come in, we cause a little trouble, but I think it's good trouble. So I do appreciate your value add to this project. Clearly a well-designed study. I love the mixed methods approach and, you know, effort to reach out to a variety of different kinds of informants as you have. So terrific work. Thank you so much for joining us. Any last minute questions, comments before we turn to closing the meeting?
No, I'm just totally curious. Bob, how many Arctic cities are there over 12,000 people that are in the database, or maybe Emily?
Emily.
We have 46 in our database.
46.
Yeah,
Okay.
21 in Russia, 3 in Alaska, 3 in Canada, 2 in Iceland, 1 in Greenland, 1 in the Faroe Islands. And then I'm forgetting the breakdown for Norway, Sweden, and
Finland.
Not
Finland.
Denmark.
There we go. Yeah.
Finland. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I was just curious.
Yeah.
And Emily, I just want to make sure you have an account with the IRP Collaboration, so you're obviously welcome to come join. Hopefully you can continue to give us updates on this project so long as you're involved. I think that would be continued interest, and hopefully you're able to connect offline based on some of the connections made here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was my first IRP meeting, but it surely won't be the last. So it was really nice to meet you all. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Emily. So a quick announcement, data team, our next meeting is 24 June, 1 p.m. Eastern, and the topic is going to be a new global maritime traffic density service with good coverage in the polar regions. This is going to be based on ship tracking data, automatic identification system data. So 24 June, 1 p.m. Eastern. Look out for that agenda. Thank you. Over to you, Jonathan, for anything to close out. Any comments, or Hazel?
Hazel?
I guess that I would also say we're going to have that meeting for the data team at the end of June, at the beginning of July, July 8th, probably around 3 p.m. Eastern, but stay tuned for updates. There's going to be a joint meeting between the data and observing team focused on more of the international planning efforts. So if that's of interest to you, join the list or let me know, and we'll keep you updated. And that's all I have. Thanks all for joining us.
Yeah, thanks a lot, everybody. Have a nice long weekend.
Thank you. Bye,
Okay,
everyone.
I know.
Thank you, Emily, Alan, and
Thank you.
Hazel, as usual, for organizing all this, and